Before The Mummy came to movie theaters in 1932, there had already been a tradition for a half-century before that of written stories of mummies rising from ancient Egypt and cursing and killing the archaeologists and others who disturbed their resting places. These were mummy stories, but it wasn't a crusty, limping, wrapped-up corpse, and instead, it would be a beautiful, exotic woman with supernatural powers. These stories originated from the white guilt or manifested sense that desecrating burial grounds of other cultures might not be on the level, karmically speaking. I covered this in part 1 of this series. You can go back and start in part 1 or just stay here, as each one of these videos is going to be self-contained. One of the most well-known of these stories was written by Bram Stoker. It was called Jewel of the Seven Stars. You might have expected that we were going to jump straight to the Brendan Fraser era, but there are 4 adaptations of Jewel of the Seven Stars at the time I'm making this video, and they start with the last Hammer horror production in 1971 and finish in 1998, which fills the gap between the Hammer horrors and the Brendan Fraser era perfectly. Part of the inspiration for Bram Stoker was based in some real history. Queen Hatshepsut found herself in a situation where the only male heir was a child, and so she took the throne herself, and because the Egyptian world was also a misogynist's paradise, she turned all of her statues and tributaries into a male appearance, and after she died, her name was erased and most of her statues were destroyed. There are other coincidences that match from Stoker's story to real history, like finding her in the Valley of Kings, but it's not terribly important when watching. So the plot is a quintessential Egyptian Gothic from the late 1800s. It features the core trope of all mummy legends of disturbing sacred tombs and getting cursed for it, and being a pre-1932 mummy story instead of a rotting, ragged corpse coming after our protagonist. It's a beautiful woman, and reincarnation is also a theme. An archaeologist obsessed with resurrecting the Egyptian mummy Queen Tera becomes entranced by a jeweled ring and is struck down comatose. Meanwhile, his daughter Margaret is becoming possessed by the spirit of Queen Tera as a vessel for her reincarnation. Her father had disturbed Tera's tomb 18 years ago, and as his wife died during childbirth, and now that Margaret was an adult, her father hadn't realized that Tera would use his daughter as a means for her return. None of these movies quite nails the exact plot as a straight-up adaptation, but most of the hallmarks are there. Beautiful female mummy, obsessed old man, daughter tormented, and a ring. 1970, Mystery and Imagination, Curse of the Mummy. Now, normally I wouldn't include any old TV episode into a list of theatrical productions, but aside from this being the first chronologically, and it almost being a feature length at 76 minutes, it also seems to be the most accurate to the original Stoker story, so let's just sneak this one in now. Mystery and Imagination was an anthology TV series largely adapting literary classics like Sweeney Todd and Frankenstein and The Telltale Heart. The series ran for 5 years, produced 24 episodes in total, and The Curse of the Mummy was the last episode. You can find it on YouTube in terribly low resolution, or at least I did. The main problem each of these adaptations is likely to face is an audience perception of what a mummy movie is. Without understanding Jewel of the Seven Stars, most of the comments are likely to be like, "Where's the mummy?" and "The plot makes no sense, so boring," and that's totally fair, but it helps to know the history, and then this becomes a serviceable version of the original story. Maybe it's a bit flat and plain, but it's still the first. (1971) Blood from the Mummy's Tomb. So we left our last chapter covering the Hammer horror movies with the Blood from the Mummy's Tomb, which here is our first theatrical adaptation of Bram Stoker's book. There was so much trouble in this production, it should have been called Curse of the Mummy's Tomb. That's a little mummy humor for you. The script was troubled with infighting and rewrites that made no sense. Peter Cushing was hired and shot a few days before his wife was diagnosed with emphysema, and then he left. There's a few photos of him on set that have survived, but his scenes were reshot with a new actor. Director Seth Holt died of a heart attack on set after 5 weeks of shooting, and producer Michael Carreras took over. Carreras also directed the 1964 movie The Curse of the Mummy's Tomb for Hammer. The movie itself is still probably the best out of the Jewel of the Seven Stars adaptations. Hammer gives the film prestige, Valerie Leon gives it sex appeal, and while it's set in a contemporary setting of modern-day swinging London of the 70s, I think that this stands as the most entertaining of the 5 versions that we're going to cover here today. 1980, The Awakening. This is a slow-burning psychological thriller, a little too slow in my opinion. It's pretty authentic to the mechanics of the plot about an archaeologist who disturbs a tomb 18 years ago, and now his 18-year-old daughter is becoming obsessed with this ancient Egyptian queen. It all sounds good enough, but it's a really slow burn. In horror movie terms, this isn't a monster movie so much as it is a psychological thriller with supernatural elements like The Exorcist or The Omen. Lots of scenes filled with dread and unease, punctuated with short scenes of shock. In this case, light on the shock. The production is pretty lavish with big set locations, and being in Egypt, which is the only spot where this movie has the Hammer horror movies beat. Egypt's really Egypt. The problem is, aside from Charlton Heston, there's no mummy. But there's not even like a hot lady mummy. It also chose to be a modern movie rather than a period piece, which I always think hurts the movie a little in this case. Even the director said the production was brutal, and he wasn't happy with the final cut of the film, which had been recut without him. So slow movie, no mummy. It's cool to see Stephanie Zimbalist outside of Remington Steele in an early role, but that doesn't really make it worth a watch in my opinion. 1986, The Tomb. Michelle Bauer. Fred Olen Ray. You know where we are now? If those names were recognizable to you, then you know we're in the heart of 80s B movies. Fred Olen Ray is prolific, but his most beloved movies are inarguably made in the 80s. Michelle Bauer is a former Penthouse pet and a legitimate scream queen from the golden age of scream queens. Honestly, this movie might not even belong in this section, as the movie is often attributed as an adaptation of Bram Stoker's story, but there's no credit for that listed, and nobody's ever confirmed it. There are some character names like Banning, the main heroic lead, that references past mummy movies, but that could just be fan service. There's the desecration of a female mummy queen that comes with a curse, which tracks, but that's also just a common trope of these Egyptian Gothics. You could lambast the movie for terrible performances and forced line readings, but that's not why you watch a B movie. You watch it for the big boobies and gore and campy, cheesy fun, terribly offensive one-liners, and all of that tracks here. I think the end kind of fizzles out, but the mummy sports a nice rack even when in her most decomposed state, so I guess it depends on what you're watching the movie for. Considering her prolific B-movie resume, The Tomb will always be remarkable for being the very first Michelle Bauer film. I do find it incredibly unlikely that this was intended as an adaptation of Jewel of the Seven Stars, but just in case it's included. The Tomb comes from an era of great B-movies and is fun on its own merits, and should probably be viewed as such. There's a bit of two-fisted Indiana Jones-style tomb raiding, Sybil Danning has a brief cameo at the start, and even in the ridiculous and creative opening credits, it's evident that there was a lot of care and attention and enthusiasm going into the final product. 1998, Bram Stoker's Legend of the Mummy. Our fourth theatrical and last attempt to tell the Bram Stoker vision boasts Louis Gossett Jr. and makes a decent attempt to do the original story, but as befell the previous adaptations, it's also pretty dry and generally unrewarding. Louis Gossett Jr. isn't even a main feature. He barely gets as much screen time as Al Borland from Home Improvement does.
What dynasty?
19th. 18th.
Ah, that'll work, boy. You are hot today.
There's nothing more I can teach you.
Again, it's set in the modern world, and with this straight-to-video production, it's predictably lackluster. Most shots are medium shots, indoors, in rooms all lit pretty much the same way, giving the film almost no range or dynamics visually. Somehow this endless parade of medium shots with its droning exposition, dialogue sort of anesthetizes your eyes and mind, and you just forget you're watching it and start thinking about what groceries you should pick up tomorrow, because I gotta get almond milk. Because, I don't really do well with dairy. And yeah, what was I talking about? Yeah, I forgot. See? I don't think this story has seen its definitive version yet, and as far as the ones released so far, you might be best to stick to the Hammer horror classic. In the next chapter, we will cover Universal Studios' return to the Mummy franchise and how they reinvented it for a whole new generation. And then there's still Aztec mummy movies, children's mummy movies, alien movies, and more.